Frankenstein's Aunt by Rune Pettersson, Ashen Light. Hannah Frankenstein struck the gong. A fanfare of vibrating brass rang through the hall, and the crowd fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Hannah Frankenstein in a loud, firm voice, "I bid you welcome to this little soiree. It gives me great pleasure that so many of you have responded to my invitation, because we all know that for quite a time the village, both in the present and the past, has been troubled by certain irregularities. But ladies and gentlemen, all that is now at an end. From now on, things will be different. From now on, Frankenstein Castle will be a center of science and culture, open to muses, but not to horrors." The audience applauded. She went on, "Tonight, I hope, the muses of astronomy and tragedy will hold a protective hand over our little party, and we start the program with a lecture on the moon by a genuine specialist in the field, Mr. Lawrence Talbot." She stepped aside and gestured toward the end wall, where Larry Talbot and Franz had entered through a side door, both in dinner jackets. The audience applauded again. When Aunt Frankenstein retreated through the sea of clapping, she saw another guest arriving, slipping in through the doors, apparently rushed and conscious of his late arrival. He was a dark, bearded man of indefinite age, wearing a brown tweed suit and a floppy artist's hat. He looked across the hall to find an empty seat, and Igor hurried up to meet him. When the man took his hat off, he revealed his dark, swept-back hair and deep lines in his forehead. Hannah Frankenstein thought there was something familiar about his face. Where on earth had she seen the man before? The man was given a seat by the door and sat down. Everyone's attention was now riveted on the other end of the hall, where Talbot had stepped over to the moon chart with a pointer in his hand. There was a deathly silence in the hall. At any moment, the moon would be rising. More than one member of the audience had checked the time in an almanac. "Mother," whispered Gretchen, "where's the werewolf?" The good acoustics of the hall carried her whisper right over to Talbot, who for a moment looked worried. He was already rather pale. The innkeeper's wife hushed her daughter and whispered back, "It's the man over by the map, but he doesn't turn into a werewolf any longer." "We hope not, anyhow," whispered the guard. "We hope not, anyhow," whispered the guard, fingering his bowler hat with sweaty hands. Larry Talbot licked his dry lips, his eyes flickering over the crowd, the pointer trembling in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said hoarsely, "if you look out of the window here," he pointed with the pointer, and the audience along the east wall turned right around in their seats, "then you will see the full moon is just rising above the mountains." They all saw it, like a red balloon. The August moon came sliding up behind the mountains in the east. Sweat began to break out on the palms of more than one pair of hands. Stomachs contracted, hearts fluttered, not least Hannah Frankenstein's. She thought the beating of her heart was thundering out over the hall, as in those famous ghost stories by Edgar Allan Poe. Igor appeared beside her, and she leaned down and hissed in his ear, "Keep your fingers crossed, for heaven's sake." "I am, as hard as I can," he hissed back with a smile. He had taken to smiling all the time now, since he had his new teeth. It was almost unnerving. "The moon," Talbot went on in a hoarse voice, "the moon is an old acquaintance of us all. It is the earth's nearest grrr. His voice broke into a growl, and he cleared his throat in embarrassment. Aunt Frankenstein could not bear to look any more. She whispered into Igor's ear again, "Who's that man who's just come in?" "No idea," Igor smiled back. "But he knew my name." Talbot struggled on with his moon chart, the sweat pouring off his face. He took off like a man who stammers, pointing desperately at the full moon with his pointer like a fencer with a rapier. "The moon is the Earth's nearest neighbor in space, a cold and inhospitable planet." Gretchen's impatient voice could now be heard all through the hall. "Mother, won't he ever turn into a werewolf?" "Heaven preserve us," thought Hannah Frankenstein. "Why didn't I ban children from the party? Why did I have this party at all?" She began to wonder quite seriously whether she ought to evacuate the whole hall quickly before it was too late. But she felt sorry for Talbot. This was the chance of a lifetime for him. This was his chance to redress and readjustment to a human life. "Bravo, Larry!" cried the postmistress encouragingly, and the butcher looked sulky. The great red balloon of moon of a moon was now right above the mountains, large and challengingly circular as it sailed on outside the window. Talbot's face twitched in a disturbing way, and Igor hissed, "Look, his face is quite ashen." As Igor was slightly deaf, his hissed words were louder than he had intended, and could be heard all over the hall. An uneasy murmur began to spread along the benches, but Talbot found another thread, and desperately started winding it in. "As I said, the moon is now full. But at the new moon, one can also observe a phenomenon called the Ashen Light." "Ashgar! Ashgar!" He was off again, and an ashen light seemed to lie all over the hall. "Talbot!" shouted Franz. "Don't forget the Sea of Tranquility! The Sea of Tranquility, Talbot!" "No, exactly," said Talbot. "Thank you. And then there is something called the Sea of Tranquility." A great calm spread over his pale face. The crisis was over. But now Aunt Frankenstein's nerves could stand it no longer. She walked across the floor and started clapping. "An excellent lecture, Mr. Talbot," she said. "An excellent lecture, short and concise. Thank you very much. Now we know a great deal about the moon that we did not know before. Let us give Mr. Talbot a hearty round of applause." Everyone clapped, and cheering broke out, the postmistress standing up and crying, "Bravo, Larry, bravo!" The butcher looked terribly cross, clapping his sausage fingers with an absolute minimum of sound. Hannah Frankenstein continued across the floor, calling for silence. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the second number of the evening." Eternally grateful and happy, Talbot staggered out through the side door and was patted by his second, Franz. A boxer who had just won the heavyweight world championship could not have been sweatier or happier. And that's the end of that chapter.